After 4 rounds, Hans Niemann is currently in the lead at the Tata Challengers tournament. He has been playing great chess, and today we're going to look at his instructive 4th round win against the talented Indian player Divya Deshmukh. Hans opens with e4, now e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, d3, knight f6, castles. This is all well-known stuff in the Italian. h6 is an interesting move that has gained a lot of traction in the past few years. Now white plays c3, d6, rook e1, castles, and now a very standard developing move, knight bd2. This is the classical and best way to develop this knight on b1. So white will place the knight on f1, where it will either go to e3, taking control of the squares on f5 and d5, or alternatively it can go to g3, where it protects the pawn on e4 and prepares to move d3 to d4. So black now plays the move bishop b6 and now bishop b3, another very standard move in these type of positions, because white now gains the additional option of playing knight c4, threatening knight takes b6, winning the bishop pair. Black plays the move rook e8, now h3, bishop e6. Now the move knight c4 is possible, but Hans goes for another very standard move in the Italian with the move bishop a4. And the idea is that he's trying to exploit this slightly weird position of the knight on c6 and bishop on e6. And he's trying to go for a well-timed d4, threatening d5 with a nice 4. There are also other ideas like going for bishop takes c6, ruining black's structure, and then going for d4. So black plays the move a6. So she's stepping out of the move knight c4 because now there'll be the move bishop a7, so you no longer win the bishop pair. But actually I think even better instead of a6 was to go for the move d5. And after e takes d5, bishop takes d5, position is double-edged and black seems to be alright here. After a6, white continues his same knight maneuver with knight f1, knight d7, and now knight e3. And since the black knight has moved from f6, now black no longer controls the square on d5, so white's trying to exploit that. Maybe he's going to put his knight there. So black decides to take the knight, bishop takes e3, and now knight b6. And I'm not a big fan of this decision because now white has a lot of good ways to get a comfortable position. Now the simplest to me seems bishop takes b6, and after c takes b6, d4. And white has a nice structure, it's threatening d5, so black has to react to this. Or I can play b5, the bishop can just go back, and white has a very good position. But after knight b6, Hans comes up with another very interesting option. He plays bishop takes c6, b takes c6, and now d4. And even though the computer is not that big of a fan of this, I quite like this idea because now what Hans has gone for is a position with opposite colored bishops. With a very nice structure and being the first one to break in the center, it's quite clear who is going to be playing for the initiative here. And as we all know, opposite bishops favor the attacker. So here black plays f6, trying to bolster the center. Now white plays a very nice move, b3. So white is taking control of the c4 square and is restricting this knight on b6. Black plays bishop f7, now c4, further restricting the knight and taking control over the center. Black takes on d4, bishop takes d4, and now c5. Bishop just drops back to c3, bishop g6, and now knight d2. And the idea is that after queen d7, white now plays f4 and pushes the pawn to f5. And now white signals that he's going to be playing for a kingside attack, which actually has some real venom to it, as the black pieces are slightly cramped and all of white's pieces are pointing towards the black king. So black plays bishop h7 and now queen g4, bringing the queen into the field of action. Here black played king h8, and it's quite clear that white has a promising position, but he still needs to bring some pieces into play. Now in these type of positions, I like to tell my students, you should look for your worst placed piece and try to bring it into play. And that is exactly what Hans does. You can see that the white knight on d2 isn't really doing anything. It's performing a defensive role, defending this pawn on e4, but other than that, it's not really doing very much. So Hans decides to improve this knight, and he plays the move knight f1. So the knight hits for the h5 square, where it exerts strong pressure on the king side. The knight can also reroute itself after placing it on h5 to f4, where they go for one of these weak squares on g6 or on e6. So black goes for the move queen c6, knight g3, knight goes to h5, and now rook a e8. So now we've improved the knight, but not all of our pieces are in play because the rook on a1 is still sleeping. So Hans addresses this problem with the move rook e3, and after rook f7, rook a e1, overprotecting this strong pawn on e4. Black plays the move knight e5, the queen simply steps to h4, no problem there. Queen d7, now rook g3. White is slowly bringing pieces to the attack. Knight f4, e4, rook e7, and it's clear that white has completely outplayed his opponent, but he still needs to find a way to break through, which is not so easy because black's position is very solid. Now Hans Niemann uses another factor to his advantage. Black is playing on the increment here. It's going to be very difficult for black to make moves, given that not only does she have to worry about all sorts of tactical threats, but she only has about 30 seconds to make each move. Here white played the move bishop d2, and after knight f7, now white has a decision, and in fact here white has a very strong winning tactic, which Hans saw. Now I could go through these lines with you, but instead I think it's more fun to hear from the man himself.
When she played knight f7, I felt like there had to be something. I could have played knight g6, bishop g6, f g6, knight g5, rook g5, f g5, bishop g5, but then rook f e8. I could play bishop e7, queen e7, and it was very hard to evaluate. I wanted something more, so...
Yeah, we've all seen clearer endgames. But it turns out that after the move h4, white is actually completely winning. And the move h4 is actually essential because after rook e6, white has to move h5, just in time to defend the pawn on g6. And if black tries to activate his king with king g8, white can play g4, king f8, and now rook f1 check. And the point is that black can't even bring his king out because after king e8, white just goes in with rook f7, rook takes e4, rook takes g7, check, and king f2. And black is not in time to pick up the pawn on h5 because after rook g5, white now plays rook h7, threatening to take the pawn on h6. So black has to take on h5, but now comes a very standard but strong move. Rook h8 check, and after king e7, g7, the pawn queens, and the best black can do is play rook g5, but he's going to lose a rook for it. But I can totally understand why Hans didn't go for this, because firstly the endgame doesn't even look that clear from afar. Remember, he had to see the whole line with h4 starting from this position. Secondly, it doesn't really make much sense from a practical standpoint, because keep in mind that black at this point had only 54 seconds left on the clock, and when your opponent has such little time, the last thing you want to do is to go for a line where black's moves are completely forced, because then black can make moves very quickly and gain a lot of time with the increment, and this will make her life a lot easier. But instead, what you should be doing is give your opponent a lot of choices, and because they have to reason out which move is better, which move is worse, they can easily make a blunder. So practically I okay with what Hans did, even though it's not the best move. He went for knight d5, and after rook e8, he's sort of maneuvering around and he's just trying to slowly improve his position. Keep in mind, he can always go for the move knight g6 later if things work out, so he'll have the full 50 minutes after the time control to decide whether that endgame is winning or not. Unless black goes for the move c6, which seems to make a lot of sense because it controls the square on d5 and it stops knight d5 ideas forever. Unfortunately, this plays right into Hans's hands.
I was sort of just moving around, trying to provoke c6, and then once I provoked c6, I think it was just a matter of technique.
Who can really blame black for such a decision? After all, he's getting rid of one of white's most annoying ideas. But unfortunately, she's also weakening the pawn on d6, which is exactly what Hans tries to exploit now. So he first plays bishop c3, and after rook g8, rook d1, hitting the pawn on d6. Black plays rook d7, and now we have finally reached move 40. So the time trouble nightmare is over for black. Now Hans really takes his time and makes small improvements, and this is exactly what he should do in such a position. After all, his opponent has no counterplay, so why not to make her suffer a bit and show who's boss. So king h2, rook e7, now rook e3, queen e8, now king h1. He's really taking his time here. King g8, rook e2. So now he's ready to put his rook on d2. And now a very interesting move from black, a5. Now this seems completely absurd because it's just hanging this pawn on a5, right? Now to understand why this move is played, you're gonna understand what's wrong with black's main idea. White only has one potential weakness, and by placing a queen on e8 and the rook on e7, black is trying to target this potential weakness, namely the pawn on e4. And so a very logical move in this position would be to play knight f7, trying to play knight g5 to target this pawn on e4. But unfortunately, there is a very strong reply for white, as Hans can now destroy black's kingside pawn structure with Bishop takes f6, g takes f6, knight h5. The immediate threat is knight takes f6 with a royal fork. So black has to play queen d8, and after queen g3 check, black's completely busted. If king f8 or king h8, then queen g7 is actually just mate. So black has to block with the knight, but now knight takes f6, king h8, knight takes d7, rook takes d7, and materially black seems to be okay. But unfortunately after e5, white is just crashing through. The immediate threat is just to go through with e6, pawn on d6 is hanging, and really black has nothing better than to resign here. That's why black plays the move a5, and the idea is that after bishop takes a5, black can now play the move knight f7, and there's no longer any ideas of taking on f6 because the bishop is now offside on the a5 square. So Hans obviously ignores this pawn on a5 and he just plays the move queen g3. Black plays king h8, now rook e d2, targeting this pawn on d6. Black now plays the most critical reply, knight f7, threatening the move knight g5, when it would be impossible to defend this pawn on e4. So Hans must act immediately, and he does so. Knight h5. As my old coach liked to say, mate in one threat is always good. Black played knight g5, and now it seems like the pawn on e4 is lost, and is defended against the mate threat. But now Hans comes in with a really nice sacrifice, which I can't really give him too much credit for because it's completely forced. Knight takes f6. Now this sacrifice is unbelievably complex, so hopefully Hans can make some sense of it.
Obviously, knight takes e4 loses quite quickly, but if she could play gf6, bishop f6, rook g7, I think bishop takes d6, rook takes, and something like, I don't know, I actually kind of was blundered something. I don't know what I missed, but I suddenly was not, I think I just play f6, or no, I play, I thought like I should play rook takes d6, knight e4, rook d7, knight g3, king h2, and I'm down like a rook for, a queen for, it's like an exchange, but I'm going to win a lot of material, so I wasn't sure.
This is really a fascinating position because even though white is so much material down, white has so many threats like rook d8, rook takes g7, bishop takes g7, and it seems like white has a crushing position. In fact, after the most natural move knight f5, I can simply play rook d8, and our queen takes, rook takes, bishop g8. Simplest is just g4. If the knight moves away, for instance knight e3, and rook d7 is just winning a full rook. But it turns out that after the move king h2, white is actually not winning, but black only has one way to draw, and it starts with an amazing move, knight f1 check. Now the line is absolutely ridiculous. Firstly, if you play king h1, black's going to go back and he's happy with a perpetual. So the only way to play for a win is to play the move king g1. But now black gives a check on e3. Again, if king h1, then knight g3 is a draw. So white has to play king takes f1. But now black comes up with a really nice defensive resource. Bishop takes f5, an amazing move. And the key point is that after bishop takes g7, king g8, white is actually in big trouble because the rook on d7 is attacked by the bishop and it doesn't have any good squares. For instance, if the rook moves along the d file, then black can simply take this bishop on g7 with a winning position. However, if the white rook moves off the d file, then suddenly we have another problem with the move bishop d3 check, and white has to give up his rook, and suddenly black is the one playing for a win. So going back to this position, white only has one way to make a draw, and that's with the move rook takes g7. Black obviously plays bishop d3, rook takes d3, and now queen takes d3. Now white is threatening a nasty discovery, but he's in check. And it turns out that white only has one way to escape the check safely. For instance, if he plays king f2, then queen f5 is winning the bishop and white can resign. Similarly, if king g1, then queen e3 check will win the bishop. For instance, after king h1, simply queen c1 check, and after king h2, queen f4 check, followed by queen takes f6 on the next move. So after queen takes d3, white has to play the move king e1, queen e3 check, king d1, queen d3 check, and now not king c1 because of queen f1 check, but king e1 with a draw by perpetual check. Isn't that the most fantastic variation you've ever seen? Now it turns out that white is still completely winning after the move rook g7, but the winning move is completely absurd. White has to play the move bishop takes g5, which looks completely stupid because the bishop on f6 is pinning all black's pieces, and suddenly you just gave it up for a knight that doesn't seem to be that special. But it turns out that this knight on g5 is just so good, it's creating all sorts of counterplay, knight takes e4 threats, and to get rid of it is to get rid of black's best piece. And after rook takes g5, queen f4, white currently only has 2 pawns for the piece. But the more I look at this position, the more it becomes clear that white is completely winning and that black is just totally busted. There are 2 reasons why this is the case. Firstly, the black king is completely exposed, it's got no shelter, and secondly, the bishop on h7 might as well be a large pawn because all it's doing is staring at this pawn on f5, which is well defended by this pawn on e4. So black is completely lost. For instance, if black plays rook e7, I mean, he's got to try to get rid of this pawn if he's going to try to get anything. But unfortunately, white can play queen takes d6, and it's very important that we take with the queen because now we have ideas like queen f6 check as well as queen takes h6. And if black takes on e4, simply queen f6 check, king g8 and rook d8, winning the queen and the game. So after knight takes f6, white would have been winning in any case. But after knight takes e4, Divya makes it very easy for Hans, because now all of white's moves are very easy and almost forced. White takes on e4, rook takes e4, now rook takes d6. Don't even think of taking this rook because of mate in 1. So black plays the move rook e3. And I guess this is what Divya was hoping to get, because now she's hitting the queen as well as the bishop. But Hans is unperturbed. He simply plays the move queen g4, retaining pressure on the pawn on g7. Again, you can't take the rook because of mate. So black is in a big trouble because if rook takes c3, then simply we take the rook on d7 and black can resign. So black comes up with her last resource. Bishop takes f5, which almost works, but not quite. Hans simply takes on f5, and after rook takes d6, he comes up with a nice intermediate move. Bishop takes g7 check, destroying the black pawn structure and winning a pawn. King takes g7, and now rook takes d6. And here, Divya threw in the towel, because there's really nothing much you can do. The black king is completely naked, and the immediate threat is queen f6 check with checkmate. And if black tries to trade the queens, which is probably what she should do, there's no hope here either, because white simply takes and gets another pawn with rook takes c6. So the current count is 2 pawns up for white, but after rook a6, it's probably going to be 3. So there's really no hope in any of these positions. And so black's decision to resign was completely justified. A real positional masterpiece by Hans. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you'd like to see more Hans Niemann wins, then check out this video above. And I'll see you in the next video.